Welcome everyone, my name is Thalia Cervantes and today we're going to be talking about Magnus Carlsen at the Tata Steel Chess Championship going on in Wijk. His losses, but most importantly, his wins. Let's get right into it. So the Wijk is actually one of the strongest chess tournaments going on in the world, and as well as one of the longest running. And this particular edition is very interesting because you have a bunch of established elite chess players and at the same time a bunch of newcomers into the elite chess scene. Up until round 3, Magnus Carlsen was one of the top players leading the event. However, in round 4, he had a very interesting game against Anish Giri, where Anish actually played a really beautiful game, led into an endgame with a pawn on the 7th rank, pair of bishops, and after a really beautiful b4 move, he managed to open up some files for the rook, and the position just kept on becoming more and more unbearable for Magnus. This was a very special win for Anish Giri, as I mentioned in his interview, and he was very glad to finally win a game against Magnus after 12 years of fighting and struggling. He did accredit the fact that Magnus had been taking more and more risks against him in the last couple of games that they have played. Therefore, Giri had some chances to get wild positions against Magnus and have some chances of a decisive game. Following that, Magnus Carlsen played Nodirbek Abdusattorov, who's one of the rising junior players in the world right now, second place at the Olympiad in 2022, as well as being board 1 for the gold winning team. In this game, Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces decided to take some more risks, and he gave up an exchange in the middle game to try and get back some initiative against the black king and some open files to create counterplay. However, all of the material became a really strong pressure point for Magnus, and he ended up letting his counterplay slip, and the position led to a very nice, very instructive queen endgame, which I highly recommend if any of you want to study queen endgames more and the theory of them. Nodirbek had the upper hand in the game from the middle game, and he led it all the way into the endgame, not giving Magnus a chance to even make a draw. And this was the second consecutive loss for Magnus, which marked a really huge point because he has not lost 2 games in a row since 2015. So, what happens now after 2 very devastating losses in a tournament where Magnus had been asked previously about his aims to reach 2900? It must be extremely disappointing. Especially at the top levels, you often don't see players losing games so frequently. They tend to be very solid, very concise, very cold-headed at times, and this is just a rare occurrence. It's very fun to watch as a chess fan, but for the players it can be heartbreaking at times. However, one very interesting point is the way that Magnus completely came back after those 2 losses, and he managed to win 3 games in a row against Rapport, Fabiano Caruana, and Parham Maghsoodloo. Let's get into round 7 of the tournament. Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces against Rapport. It was a very interesting game, started off as a Petrov, and soon enough it got into very interesting territory with knight to d3. Usually players would do knight to f3, and this would lead to mainline theory. However, recently knight to d3 has become a very popular approach because after knight takes e4, queen to e2, queen to e7, knight to f4, and the idea now is to go knight to d5 and put some pressure on the queen. Of course, black pieces is not going to allow that, especially someone as strong as Rapport. Pawn to c6 was played, f3, knight to f6, pawn to d4. And you might be thinking, okay, there is no reason why to go for this line. There is a queen trade so suddenly, and it's going to be very difficult to find any advantage. It's just going to be an endgame. But as you can see, Rapport decided to play with bishop to f5, and the idea is that the queen trade, sure, is an endgame, but at the same time, white has a very comfortable position. The king is going to go to f2, and soon enough they'll be gaining space on the king side with g4 and h4. In the game, bishop to f5 was played, pawn to c4, h5, knight to c3, knight a6 with a very clear idea of bringing the knight to b4 and potentially c2. King to f2 was played, knight to b4, queen to d1. And right now you can see that, okay, both sides are in the process of developing and getting their pieces out of the way, but it just seems so much more natural for black than it is for white. The king going to f2, the queen going back to d1. It's not so clear how Magnus is going to finish off his development. However, after castle, knight to d3, pawn to d5 was played by Rapport, and the player with the white pieces has to be extremely careful because the d file is about to be opened up. The pawn on d4 is going to become completely isolated. And as we know, if the king is still in the center or it has a very unclear situation, it is good to open up the position. And that is what black is aiming towards. So the only move here that does not give advantage to black is the one that was played, pawn to c5. And after knight takes d3, bishop takes c3, knight to e4 was played. And to surprise of no one, this was a very creative combination by Rapport, who loves this type of play. The issue is that after pawn takes, bishop to e2, the question is how to continue, right? And the compensation for black is going to be mainly this d file, the possibility of the queen jumping out, and the white king just being so exposed. Queen to f6 was played, bishop to e3. The only problem is that this bishop on f5 does not actually have any great discovery. For example, if this bishop was not on e2, black could play bishop to g4 and get the queen. But the bishop is on the way, and it means that this bishop on f5, sure, it can move out of the way and give a check, but it doesn't create any extra threat beyond that. Bishop to c5 was played, playing with the fact that there is a pin on the queen here on d1. But Carlsen says, okay, you go take my pawn, I play rook to f1, I'm going to bring my king to g1, and all of a sudden I'm going to be fine. It's going to be like nothing happened. Like I castled the normal way, right? Queen to h4, king to g1, and all of a sudden it's not so clear how black is going to continue. It feels like the best that could have happened for them already went away. And now it's more about creating some sort of checkmate that either completely works or doesn't work. But the great thing about the top players in the world is that they just have impeccable defensive skills. So bishop to d6, clearly going after h2, and Magnus says, okay, you can take my pawn. Rook takes f5, queen takes h2, king to f1, and it's not clear at all how black is going to get material back for this. Queen to h1, bishop to g1, pawn to g6, asking the rook where it's going, and Magnus just keeps on taking material. Rook takes f7, there's no fear of opening up the f-file. Bishop to c4, protecting the bishop. Bishop to h2 was played, going after g1, but just for example, if rook takes f7, bishop takes f7, rook f8, there's queen b3, and all of a sudden it's not so clear who is going to be under attack, right? Because after bishop to h2, there is some queen e6, and it looks like the black king is also in a lot of trouble. Soon enough, king to f2 can be played, and white can get away with taking all the pieces and running away. So, bishop to h2 was played in the game, king to f2, rook takes f7, bishop takes f7, rook to f8, queen b3, there's almost the same line, bishop takes g1, rook takes g1, queen to h4, king e2, and after a couple of moves, it was very obvious that black didn't have enough. Even after taking the bishop on f7, the knight comes back to e2, white is a piece up, and the black pawns will never be enough. Queen to h3, takes 6, rook f3, rook to g3, and here Richard Rapport resigned with the black pieces. In his interview, Magnus Carlsen said that he was looking forward to this game as a way to come back into the tournament, and that he was really glad that Richard Rapport had such a innovative, creative, dynamic style that it would allow for the game to be very interesting, very chaotic, as you guys were able to see, and this meant that it would give him some chances to get a win and then carry that momentum towards a better tournament. So, very good comeback from Magnus. Let's go on to the next game, which was him with the black pieces against St. Louis favorite Fabiano Caruana. So the game started with e45, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop b5, a6. It's a Spanish, probably, you know, the most played opening in the history. It has a very long-running theoretical history. Lots of players have played it from the 1500s to the 21st century, and it doesn't seem like it's stopping anytime soon. Bishop to a4, knight to f6, castle, bishop to e7, rook to e1, pawn to b5, b3 castles. Everything normal so far. a4, trying to open up the a file and putting some pressures onto this b5 pawn. It's a very common idea, especially if you, as white pieces, want to disrupt the pawn structure from the opponent. Pawn to b4 was played, a5, d6, c3, rook b8. If white decides to take, then the b file is open and there can be a lot of pressure. The rook is on the perfect spot. So h3 was played, pawn to h6, pawn to d4, going for the center. And after b takes c3, b takes c3, e takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop to d7. Now, in this position, which has been reached before, the most noticeable aspect is the pawn structure from white, right? The pawn on e4, c3, and a5. In general, you don't want to have that many pawn islands. You want to have as little pawn islands as possible. That way all the pawns are connected and they support each other. However, white is trying to get some compensation in the form of initiative for this pawn structure. And after bishop to f4, knight to e5, knight to a3. Knight to a3. It might look a little bit strange because this knight is going to the rim of the board, but there's a big problem with knight to d2, which is knight to d3. And the whole point is that this knight is going to eventually go to c4, hopefully trade off for the centered knight here on e5, and just improve the pieces finishing off the development. Rook to e8 was played, bishop to g3, bishop to f8, and pawn to f4. Whenever I see the move pawn to f4, I get very excited. It's one of my favorite moves to make, and obviously white is gaining a lot of center control after this move, as well as the tempo on the knight on e5. However, we have to always take into account the possible risks that come from a pawn move, especially moving the f-pawn, right? Which mean this diagonal right here. For the moment, that diagonal is very difficult to access, as the bishop on f8 doesn't have a clear route to it, and at the same time, this bishop on g3 still does a very good job of covering all the necessary squares. But we'll see if this move is successful or not. Knight to f6 makes sense to go for an exchange of pieces after the opponent has weakened their pawn structure, and pawn to e5 was played. Now, obviously, as we can see, white is going for the attack in the center with the pawns. The question is, does this work or does it not? So far, black hasn't done any major blunder or any major mistake. They have followed the chess principles, and the position has looked completely fine up until now. So it would be very rare if there's some sort of winning initiative here for white that just ends the game with the pawns pushing forward. However, This pawn to e5 also has the possibility of opening up the diagonal for this dark square bishop. So we'll be able to see how the bishops play a big role into this position. And after d takes e5, f takes e5, even though the knight is hanging right here on f6, black is going to have enough tactical play to compensate and lead the position towards a favorable continuation. We should definitely take into account the fact that a lot of the white pieces seem slightly uncoordinated. Like, don't get me wrong, this bishop on b3 definitely puts pressure on f7, and the knight is centralized here on d4. But at the same time, the bishop is kind of looking at a3, and it almost feels like there are too many things hanging by a thread. Knight takes d4, c takes d4, and now a really beautiful move, bishop to c6. Magnus said in his interview that at first he wasn't so sure about the evaluation of his position as Fabiano was pushing his pawns forward, but once he realized this move, bishop to c6, he knew that everything would be fine. It is a very nice move, and the whole idea is that if e takes f6, which, you know, seems like a free piece, there is actually rook takes e8, rook takes e1. The most natural continuation is bishop takes e1, because if queen takes e1, there is just rook takes b3, and the pawn on d4 is hanging, the knight on a3 is hanging. Even the bishop on g3 is a little bit under pressure. So bishop takes e1, and here you realize, okay, the queen is defending the bishop on b3, as well as defending the pawn on d4. If my queen gets onto d4, it's attacking the rook and the king at the same time, so let's go. Rook takes b3. And after rook takes b3, it's impossible to hold on to everything. And as I was mentioning earlier, the bishop's putting a lot of pressure, white pieces kind of hanging on by a thread. And after queen takes b3, queen takes d4, king to h1, queen takes a1, the position would be completely winning for black, not only because of the material, but also because there are just so many loose pieces, and in general the bishop pair is incredibly strong. So Fabiano did not take on f6, but instead he played this move, bishop to c2. And, you know, at first, bishop to c2 looks like a normal move. Perhaps it's preparing queen to d3. The threat of e takes f6 is still alive, so black needs to do something about it. But the fact that the bishop went away from such a crucial diagonal means that Magnus has a move now that is completely winning. And you don't often see in elite games a position where one of the sides is winning on move 22. But after queen to d5, what does white do, right? Because the bishop and the queen, they have a very clear threat, which is this pawn on g2. And it is very easy to attack because the white pawns have been pushed so forward. So rook to e2 was played in the game. Queen to e2 would have also defended the pawn, but this pawn on d4 would be hanging then. And if queen to d2, trying to defend that pawn, there is a really beautiful idea that kind of coincides with how the game went, so I don't want to show it right now. I want to give you time to think. But after rook to e2, feel free to try and guess the best move here for black. If you want to pause the video, you can do that. But the continuation would be rook to b4. And this is a very strong move, because how do you defend the pawn on d4, right? Bishop to f2 is impossible because it would block the rook, and the checkmate threat on g2 would come to life. And of course, if e takes f6, trying to get some material, there is still rook takes e2, queen takes e2, and queen takes d4 with a double threat. So after rook to b4, it is almost impossible for white to defend. Actually, it is impossible for white to defend. There's just no way to keep everything under control, and the lack of coordination really makes it difficult to come up with a cohesive plan. King to h2, rook takes d4, And not too long after, Magnus ended up winning the game. Let's just see the final moves. Bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, queen takes. Any endgame that you can get where you have a pair of bishops and your opponent has bishop and knight, you have a slight edge because your pieces coordinate better together. And in this case, the two bishops are just going to completely dominate the board. Knight to c4, rook to b8, rook to c1, rook b5, going after the weaknesses that the pawn left behind, which we mentioned would be very catastrophic once we got to the endgame. Pawn to e6, f takes e6, bishop takes e7, rook to c5, and there's no way to keep everything under control. After bishop to d5, Fabiano decided to resign, and this was the second win for Magnus after his two previous losses, and he's making his way back into the leaders board. And actually, that's not the end of the story. So let's go over the next game, where Magnus Carlsen is playing with the black pieces against Parham Maghsoodloo, and this is after a draw in between. So Magnus played his game against Fabiano, then had a draw, then is now playing this game. And something that I find very fascinating is that it almost feels like there is no rush. Oftentimes when us peasants have a bad streak at a tournament, we want to go on to our next game and go for a win. Throw all of our pieces into the opponent's face, try to find some sort of checkmate, and try to destroy them in the most embarrassing way possible for them. But no, there's some maturity that comes with playing chess over the years. And you need to understand yourself, and you need to understand your tournament situation. Something very admirable, I think, from Magnus is the fact that, yes, he did have a strategy against Rapport. He took some time to cool off during the rest days. He prepared for his game against Rapport. It went his way. And then for his game against Fabiano, actually, in his interview, he mentioned that he was just planning to play a solid game. To be fair, he's playing with the black pieces against one of the most consistent top players in the world. And luckily enough, things just went his way. Now, Magnus is going to keep that streak. And let's see how the last game of the tournament up until now went his way. So let's see how his game against Parham went. It started off with d4, d5. Once again, Magnus is with the black pieces. Pawn to e6, knight to c3, knight to f6. C takes d5, e takes d5, bishop to g5, bishop e7, e3, and h6. For a long time, it was thought that this Queen's Gambit decline orthodox variations were not good enough for black to equalize, but it seems like they have been coming back to life in the past couple of years. Even lines with the Janowski variation with pawn to a6 in the third move. And clearly here we can see that if, even the world champions are playing it, it means that there is some life and fire to it. Pawn to h6, bishop to h4, bishop to g4, and here Parham went for the very interesting queen to a4. In general, f3 kind of fits with the idea, because after bishop to e6, oftentimes you see bishop to d3, knight to e2, and White is playing to keep pushing in the center with pawn to e4. But instead, queen to a4 was played, pawn to c6, and bishop to d3, castle, pawn to h3, bishop to h5. And Magnus is essentially saying, okay, I have no fear. You can go g4 if you want to, which, to be fair, kind of looks like an attractive move. But after bishop to g6, this bishop is under attack, so something needs to be done about it. And if bishop takes g6, f takes g6, the f-file is open, and it's open in favor of black because they already have a rook placed there. This diagonal is going to cause a lot of pressure for White as well. And with ideas of the knight jumping over to e4, and some possible exchange, the pawn on f2 being a little bit loose, and white not finished with development and safety of the king, only means that whatever attack they're planning to do is just simply not going to work. Especially in general terms, when the queen is on the complete opposite side of the opponent's king, you would rather bring it back before you start the attack, because from here there's no way that it can get anywhere close to black king. So now that we agree that white needs to take it a little bit slow and they can't just go throwing pawns, queen to c2 was played, pawn to c5. And the idea is very clear. Okay, we can create a pair of fixed pawns here in the center, but most importantly, where does this king go? It needs to go somewhere soon. The bishop prevents it from castling long, and if the e-file opens up, it's going to be a terrible situation for the king. So, pawn to g4, finally played. C takes d4, e takes d4, bishop to g6. There's no fear. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes g6. And you might be thinking, okay, Magnus just gave up a pawn. What is this? Doesn't really make any sense. But now is when the fireworks begin to happen. If you want, you can once again take a moment to try and guess what was the next move that Magnus played in this position. But I'm going to go ahead and show it. And it was knight takes g4. Isn't this just such a beautiful move? Knight takes g4. And the idea is that if bishop takes e7, queen takes e7 comes with check. So there's no time to take back the knight here on g4. The pawn on f2 is still hanging, and white has found himself in a lost position. So if pawn takes as well, bishop takes h4, and there's no way to keep everything under control. This pawn on f2, it's going to be a problem forever. This pawn on d4 is very weak as well. White is going to struggle defending everything at the same time with the lack of development that they have, and the king is still in the center. So queen to e6 was played instead. Rook to f7, protecting from the check and at the same time defending the bishop on e7. H takes g4, bishop takes h4, knight to f3, and queen to f6. Now, Magnus is offering a queen trade for the offering a queen trade in a way that he can then play for the pawn structure that white has and continue with the problems in development that they cannot yet solve. So queen takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight takes d5, makes a lot of sense, and there's actually knight to f6. It's just essentially saying, okay, you just won the pawn on d5. Thank you for opening up the d-file. Now I'm going to use it to put pressure onto this pawn on d4, and I'm going to eventually win it. Rook to d1 was played, rook to e8, knight to e3, rook to e4. Rook to e4, putting pressure onto both pawns, and it's going to be impossible to defend. Pawn to d5 was played, trying to get out of the threats, and knight to b4. Pawn to d6, knight to c2, king to e7, takes, rook takes g4. And this endgame is equal, but at the same time it is very double-edged. As you can see, the knight right now has a hard time jumping forward because the bishop has such a great control of all of the squares. It works in long range as well, so the pawn on b2 is under a lot of pressure, as well as some rook g2 ideas. The fact that there is a pawn on d6 can work for white, but it can also work for black. Why? Because it is very close to the black territory, and at any point they can try and go after it, and it will be difficult for the white pieces to protect it. So practically, I think that it's a lot easier to play as black, and my point is kind of proven by how the game continued. Rook to d5, rook to d7. Always make sure to block past pawns, otherwise they're just going to keep going forever until they promote into a queen. Rook to f1, bishop takes b2, Rook to d3, bishop to f6 back, everything's safe and secure. Rook to d5, rook to b4 with some threats of rook b2 as well as rook b6. Rook d1, king to f7. Finally, bringing the king over to the center. There's no rush to push any of the kingside pawns. That can come after. Right now, the main point is to try and get rid of the biggest threat that white could have, which is the pawn on d6. Rook to d3, king to e6, knight to d2, rook to a4. And all of a sudden, you find that it's quite difficult to keep everything under control. We have a similar situation now as the previous game with the queen on d1. This rook on d3 protects too many things at the same time. So, rook takes a3. And the whole point is that if the rook takes, king takes on d5, getting back the rook, and the pawn on d6 still hanging. And overall, bishop versus knight tends to be very comfortable for the side that has the bishop. Plus, in this position, black is going to be 2 pawns up. Rook takes a7, king takes d6. And after now, it's just a matter of technique. But as we know, Magnus rarely ever makes any mistakes in terms of endgame technique. And he was able to win the game fairly smoothly after. Knight to e4, king to d5, knight takes f6, pawn takes f6, rook to a5, king to c4. And after maneuvering around a little bit with where the king goes and where the pawns and rook go, Magnus was just able to push the b-pawn forever. They say that all rook endgames are a draw, but sometimes, the fate is already decided. King to b3, rook to f5, preventing the pawn from going forward, but simply king to a4. And then the pawn keeps on going. The white king is blocked from getting closer to the pass pawn. And there is just no way that they're going to be able to get there in time. Rook to e6, rook takes f6, rook takes e5, king to d1. And now this is a very good moment to remember the rules of rook endgames, and there's more than one way to win. There's king to a3 as well. But the cleanest one is rook to c5, simply preventing the rook, simply preventing the king from getting closer, and with the pawn, the endgame is completely won. So rook to a6, king to b3, rook to d6, and after king to b2, the pawn keeps on marching, and at the end of the day, it's just going to be a very simple win. So those are 3 amazing wins from Magnus Carlsen after having lost 2 games in the tournament. This type of comeback is not very common. You don't often see such a revival of a chess player at a tournament after suffering from very bad scores. But this is Magnus Carlsen. He's the world champion for a reason. He has a ton of experience. He understands himself. He has confidence in himself. So once again, for the players that are at home and oftentimes play tournaments and don't know how to come back from a loss, remember that there's just so much more to come after. There's going to be a calm after the storm. Understand yourself, trust in your abilities, trust that this is just a rough patch, and plan a strategy for your comeback. The more you play, the more experience you get. I hope these games gave you some inspiration for your future tournaments. It was a great time commentating on these games. Once again, my name is Thalia Cervantes, and see you next time. Bye bye.